Hey guys, back with another video, a review on Dark Souls 3. Of course, this was going to happen sooner or later. A huge fan of the Souls series, as pretty much all of you know by now. And yeah, this game, no surprise, I love it. I think it's fantastic. You know, the original Dark Souls is kind of a nostalgic favorite for me, so it was always going to be hard for this game to beat that game for me, and you know, for me to enjoy it more. But I think when all is said and done, Dark Souls 3 is probably my favorite Souls game, and that's including Demon Souls and Bloodborne, which I know some people don't like to consider, especially Bloodborne, a Souls game, but I like to consider it one, even though it's not technically a Souls game. But even from like the Dark Souls trilogy, I think this is probably my favorite one. There's a lot of smart design decisions in this game, and Joe Cormuffin X was saying in his impressions video that they From Software basically took all they learned from the previous games and kind of took the best from each game and kind of came up with Dark Souls 3 here, and you know, took the best from each game and put it into this one. Now there are a few minor things with Dark Souls 3 that I'm not crazy about compared to previous entries, but on the whole, like, it's an incredible game. And I thought, you know, I think with the reviews were kind of surprising to me too. I thought a lot of people might be fatigued with the series, and I thought maybe I might be as well. So kind of like a diminishing returns type of thing. But no, I'm not sick of the series yet. I could still go for another game, and you know, it's almost like a yearly franchise at this point, but Miyazaki, who directed this one, has said that this is kind of like a turning point for the series, so this could be the last Dark Souls game we get. But, I mean, if the quality is this high, you know, they're pumping these games out so fast, but the quality remains incredible and quite high. It's not a huge deal to me that, you know, that they're releasing them too quick. But let's get into the review. I'm hoping that this video is not too long, but you know me, when I talk about Souls games, I go super in depth, and they tend to go on for a while. But I'll try to keep it brief, because I know a lot of people can't, you know, sit and watch like an hour-long review. But here we go, Dark Souls 3 review. Now, I guess we should talk with, like, the story. Obviously, being Dark Souls 3, it does take place after the previous games. I'm not going to talk about the lore too much. As with the previous games, you really have to, you know, you have to read a lot of item descriptions, and I'm pretty confused on a lot of the lore. I think I know the general gist of what happened throughout the game, but I'm not going to go too in-depth with that stuff, but what I do want to cover are the NPCs in this game. Now, Dark Souls 2, one of the main complaints, and one of the things that kind of bothered me a little bit with that game, or bummed me out with that game at least, were that the NPCs weren't as interesting as in the original Dark Souls, and their quest lines were fairly boring and standard, and they all had similar arcs. They all kind of ended up pretty similarly in Majula. And it's almost like From Software knew that was a minor complaint with some people, because the NPC quest lines in this game are fascinating. In fact, some of the characters in this game, I think, are some of the best characters in the entire series. One of my personal favorites in this game is this cleric named Irina. And this is not really a spoiler, but because this can happen fairly early in the game, but there's the NPCs in this game that teach you spells like sorceries and pyromancies. You have to find these tomes throughout the world, and you basically give them to these NPCs, and then they'll learn new spells that they can teach you. But of course, you have to give them some souls to learn them. But this cleric is what she provides you with the miracles if you're going for like a miracle build. And there's this forbidden dark tome that you come across, and if you talk to her when you have it, and you're planning to give it to her, she says, "Oh, this is a forbidden tome. I really shouldn't be reading this, but for you, I'll do it." So you have the option to give it to her, and I did. And it basically kind of corrupts her, and then her quest line kind of goes from there and changes depending on if you give her this book or not. And she's got kind of like this this other character with her that kind of guards her. And her whole plot line is there's a lot of cryptic shit to it, as with a lot of the quest lines in this game, but they're fascinating. I was so involved with these characters. I really wanted to see how their quest lines were going to end up. And a lot of them you can actually mess up pretty easily, which, you know, if you're going for the platinum, and I'll get into this maybe a bit later, it can be kind of frustrating, but I actually didn't mind how cryptic some of these quest lines are. I thought they were really interesting. There's another character, I think his name is Siegward. He might be the son of Siegmeyer from the original Dark Souls. I'm not sure on that. I'd have to really look into the lore. But that character, when the first time you meet him, he's so badass. He kind of helps you fight this kind of mini-boss, and he's just really hilarious. And his questline is really interesting too, but it's quite hard to find him later in the game in certain other spots. There's these other two characters, and when you find these characters throughout the world, they'll kind of return to the Firelink Shrine, which is your kind of main hub. And they'll leave the Firelink Shrine at different points. It's not like in Dark Souls 2 where once the characters get to Majula, they kind of stay there for like the entire game. And it's kind of boring in that way. But in this game, they're always leaving, coming to and from Majula. And a lot of the times it depends on where you find them and what you do before you talk to them in certain cases. Before you defeat some bosses. Certain characters might appear in different areas. You can help summon some of these characters with summon signs sometimes, depending on the bosses. Like, there's so much to uncover with the NPCs in this game, and it was one of the big highlights for Dark Souls 3 for me, and it was a huge step up from Dark Souls 2. The original Dark Souls, I loved all the NPCs, and I thought most of them had really interesting quest lines, so I'm glad they brought that back with Dark Souls 3, and I think it's even stronger in a lot of ways compared to the first game. So, yeah, a definite strength of the game is with its NPCs and NPC quest lines. I guess now we'll kind of get into the gameplay. If you've played previous Souls games, you generally know what to expect. They haven't changed things too much, but I do want to talk about the differences. Now, basically, as I'll talk about some of the design decisions with compared to like previous Souls games. As with Dark Souls 1 and 2, the Estus Flasks make a return where you basically have a limited amount in the beginning. You start with 3, and basically when you rest at a bonfire, it replenishes all your Estus Flasks. And Dark Souls, it's kind of similar to Dark Souls 2 because Dark Souls 2 started you out with 1 Estus, but you also had healing items you could use. There are no healing items in Dark Souls 3. But you start off with more Estus Flasks, and you can upgrade them in a few different ways. You can first upgrade them with undead bone shards to kind of make it so that they replenish more health. Or you can find Estus shards, and this is similar to Dark Souls 2, where you can basically increase the amount of Estus Flasks you have for healing. And there's magic Estus Flasks in this game. They're called Ashen Estus Flasks. And they replenish your magic, though it's called focus points in this game, I'm pretty sure. Or is it force points? It's FP. And those actually, for your sword arts, and we'll get into those use FP as well. And your Ashen Estus Flask recovers this, which is its own bar. You have your health bar, your focus bar, and then your stamina bar. And you have to allot your Estus Flasks in a certain way. So, basically, you can have 5 Estus Flasks, and you can allot them in any way you want between magic and... I'm going to call it magic for the purposes of this review. Magic and health. So, if you're like a sorcerer type character, and I went with a pyromancer for my character, I would basically have it so that I had health flasks, but I had a few Ashen Estus Flasks. So in the beginning, I would have, say, 3 health flasks and then 2 magic flasks. And you can go to Firelink Shrine and change this at any time, how you see fit. So that system, I think, is fantastic. I think it's amazing. Because in previous games, the magic, you had certain charges on your spells. You could only use a certain amount before you had to rest at a bonfire. And this allows you to just use more magic in general. And it's much better than the system in Demon Souls where you had to get items that replenished your magic and you could easily run out. So, yeah, this is a design decision that I absolutely love. It's kind of this great combination between Dark Souls 1 and 2, basically. Well, Yeah, Dark Souls 1 and 2, because there's no longer healing items, which I've never been a fan of healing items in these games, so I'm glad that that's gone. So you have to be really conservative with your flasks in this game, and it was really fun finding the upgrade items throughout the world. So that's one of the changes. The other I talked about are sword arts, and melee characters I feel like are kind of a focus with this game. Magic is pretty underpowered in this game from what I've seen. Pyromancy is actually really powerful. The Great Chaos Fireball that I got just absolutely wrecked everything. But from what I've seen, sorcery and especially miracles are quite underpowered. I don't know why they went with that decision. It's actually one of the complaints I have with the game, because I've actually always liked doing magic builds in these games. But watching one of my friends at 2222, we played alongside each other. And he went with a sorcerer build, and it was rough. From what I saw, it was pretty rough. It's a good supplementary build for like co-op, but if you're by yourself, if you're doing solo, it seems kind of underpowered, which is unfortunate. Now they can always buff it in a patch, and I hope they do so. But it's definitely disappointing to see. So those of you that really liked doing magic type builds in the Souls games, you might be a little disappointed there. But the variety of spells that you find is insane, and the variety of builds is still pretty insane. The game doesn't have hexes. The hexes are no longer in the game from Dark Souls 2, but I don't feel a lot of people would miss that anyways. But sword arts are what like each weapon, and even staffs actually have sword arts. Each weapon has its own kind of skill, basically, that uses force points, and you have to two-hand your weapon and press L2 to use these. And it depends on the weapon type. So axes will have this war cry ability, which basically improves your damage for a little while. And I forget a lot of the abilities. I actually didn't get to use them too much because I didn't do a melee-focused class, but I did use a few melee weapons. Like, my character was not pyromancy only by any means. And this was really cool. I liked the sword art system. It doesn't make a huge impact, and it's not as cool as the transforming weapons from Bloodborne, but I do think it's a nice addition to the series, nonetheless. What else? It's nice to go back to summon signs with Dark Souls 3. Bloodborne used this bell summoning system, and it just didn't work. Like, it was so hard to get people to join your games and get into PvP and things like that. This game, for what I did try co-op, it worked so great because dedicated servers, for the first time in the series, Dark Souls 3's got dedicated servers. So if you put up your summon sign, within seconds you're going to get summoned. It's pretty crazy. And when you're in the human form, which we'll talk about how hollowing works in this game, you'll get people joining your games constantly, and you'll get invaded a lot. I've never been invaded so much in a Souls game as I have with this one, and yeah, I've always kind of liked the invasion elements of this game. It's always really fun when you're doing co-op or you're by yourself. Someone invades you and you take them out and get a nice amount of souls. Hollowing, it works a little differently in this game. In a lot of the Souls games, every time you died, you lose a bit of your maximum health. In this game, you do have more health when you're in human form, right? But it's not a whole lot more. When you die, you're gonna lose a little bit of health, like not enough to be half health like in Demon Souls, but just a smaller amount of health in general, which I think that's good. It's kind of incentivizes you to kind of stay in the human form. And there's some lore implications with the hollowed form that have to do with some NPCs that I don't really want to spoil, but in terms of the game's like story and NPCs and some of the quest lines, the hollowing kind of plays into that. And I don't really want to spoil that stuff, because that stuff is really fascinating and unique as well. But I do like how the health system is not as punishing in this game, but it's not as, like in the original Dark Souls, if you were in hollowed form, you wouldn't lose any health at all. So a lot of players would just stay in hollowed form because there wasn't really a negative with it. But in this game there still is, but it's just not as punishing as previous games. So again, I think it's got that perfect balance for this game. I think it's got the best design in terms of the Souls games there. Now the world itself, we'll talk about the world itself and how it compares to previous games. One of my favorite things about the original Dark Souls is how interconnected the world was. From the beginning there wasn't a whole lot of ways you could go, but they were all interconnected, and a lot of the areas were kind of for higher level characters. And later in the game, it got even more interconnected where you could visit these previous areas. And basically, in the original Dark Souls, most areas you could go to right off the bat. You could get some like really crazy weapons if you were willing to run past a bunch of enemies. And yeah, I loved that. I thought that was cool. Dark Souls 2, it was kind of a disappointment in that way. It started out pretty non-linear with a bunch of different ways to go, but the second half of the game was extremely linear, just going from place to place with no alternate routes. And there weren't very many optional areas. Bloodborne, the structure was a little different. It sort of reminded me of Demon Souls, where you kept going back to a hub that wasn't a part of the main world, but the main world was pretty interconnected. But not in the way Dark Souls 1 was. It was hard. You couldn't go from like one area of the map to another, and it wasn't interconnected as like it was probably more interconnected logically, but you couldn't do a lot of walking from one area to the other. It was smarter to just go to the hub world and then warp to wherever you needed to be. Dark Souls 3 is the most linear Souls game by far, and I'd heard this in a few reviews, and this was disappointing to me. But actually playing the game, it didn't bother me as much as I was expecting it to. And that's because the individual levels in this game are some of the best designed levels I've seen in the entire series. Most of them are insanely complex, extremely labyrinthian, and just a joy to explore, with all these optional hidden paths and hidden secrets to find. Now, the game's not entirely linear, but you do feel like you're kind of going in a straight line the entire game. Most of the time, you only have at least 2 or 3 ways to go at any given time, and 1 or 2 of those ways is always going to lead to a dead end. So you're kind of being, you kind of feel like you're on a straight line, and that's a little disappointing. But I think that this extremely strong level design in general makes up for it, because Dark Souls 2. As much as I like that game a lot, I think the level design was probably the weakest in the series. It was a little bland. A lot of the areas were kind of bland, and the environments in this game kind of start off sort of bland. The undead settlement is a little dull. Everything's kind of brown and gray and green. But for the further in you get, the more interesting the environments become. And the world actually does get a little more interconnected the further you get. Still not to the level of Dark Souls, which is a little disappointing, but the environments later in the game are breathtaking. Like, there's this one environment that's, Dark Souls is known for like the kind of gorgeous views where you'll see messages on the ground. Gorgeous view, gorgeous view. The first time you hit Honor Londo in the original Dark Souls, there was this amazing moment. And there's this location in the game, around halfway throughout the game, that gives Honor Londo a run for its money. When I first found this area, I was just like, wow, holy shit. So yeah, the level design overall is just fantastic. It's just the exploration and the sense of discovery, like with previous games, is just unmatched. Like, no one does it like From Software does. It's just... It's insane. But yeah, other than that, in terms of gameplay, I mean, the combat is still fantastic. It's a little faster this time around, and they took this from Bloodborne, where rolling has worked better than ever before in this game. Now, the combat isn't as fast as Bloodborne, and obviously shields are back. You can go with a shield tanky type build, but I was surprised how effective rolling was in this game. I rarely used a shield. I rolled past almost every enemy attack, and the sense of speed is just far greater in this game compared to previous Souls games. So I appreciated that as well. I thought that was a nice carryover from Bloodborne. A lot of assets seem to have been reused from Bloodborne, especially in the beginning of the game. You might be like, oh wow, this reminds me of Bloodborne a lot. But like I said, the environments get a little different later in the game, and I think the environment variety is just stellar overall, though maybe not quite to the level of the original Dark Souls, or actually even Dark Souls 2, but the areas are just so much better designed that it's not too big of a deal. I guess the only other thing I can think of with, like, in terms of, like, negatives for this game is PvP, and this isn't actually the game's fault, but there is one thing I would like to see changed with the series overall. I was trying to go for the Platinum with this game, and I decided not to, because you have to do a crazy amount of PvP. Like, you have to, like, get rank really high in the Covenants, which actually I haven't talked about the Covenants yet, but yeah, so I gave up on the Platinum, and most of it was due to the PvP, because you had to get, like, 30 items for each Covenant, you had to do a bunch of invading, and I really think Estus Flash should be disabled from PvP in these games. It just makes the fights so prolonged. They go on forever, and everybody just like runs away when they're low on health, and Estus up uses their flasks. And it's too hard to attack people while they're chugging Estus. I feel like Estus heals too quickly for PvP. Now, I understand that if you're just playing on your own and you're invaded, and Estus flasks were disabled, yeah, it might feel a little unfair. So in that way, I wish they had a way to give the player character at least a couple Estus flasks. But still, when you killed the invader, you get yours back that you had previously. But have the invader just not have any Estus. I don't know, some people might not like that design decision, but for me, it was just... PvP started to get frustrating towards the end, especially when I felt kind of forced to do it with like the Platinum. And I understand that PvP is mostly optional. It's kind of this optional feature, but I don't think I could ever get into it just because of the way Estus flasks are handled in PvP and healing in general. And yeah, you can use those items that prevents Estus recovery, but that's still kind of annoying to have to do that. So yeah, kind of a complaint. Covenants are another thing that have been improved with this game, though. Before in previous games, they were a little obtuse with how they worked. In this game, it's very easy. You just kind of look at the item that the Covenant gives you. You look at the item description, and it will basically explain how the Covenant works. And you equip these items, and you'll be summoned automatically, depending on what Covenant it is. There's some repeat Covenants, but there's some new ones too that are real cool, or that are really cool. I don't really want to spoil what the Covenants are, because some of the fun of the game is kind of experimenting with them and seeing how each one works. But the Covenant system overall has been fairly overhauled, and it's just far less obtuse in general, and more fun to experiment with. The game is huge. Like with previous Souls games, it's absolutely massive. It took me 60 hours to beat, and I've seen a lot of variance with that. I guess the Souls game, it really depends on what type of player you are, but for me at least, the type of player that just explores everything, every nook and cranny. I did every optional area, every optional boss. Yeah, it took me 60 hours, so it's a huge game. The boss fights, I think some of the strongest boss fights in the entire series. I think the game, on the whole, is just really consistent. There's no area in this game that I thought was bad. And for the bosses, there was only one or two that I didn't like. But there wasn't any boss that I thought was flat out terrible. Like with the Bed of Chaos in Dark Souls, or some of the Dark Souls 2 bosses, which Dark Souls 2 just had too many bosses for me. It's just the right amount of bosses. There's one boss towards the end, one of the optional bosses, that is just so fucking cool, man. The spectacle is great. The difficulty for this game, maybe it was because of my character, but I didn't feel like it was especially difficult. It might be one of the easier Souls games. Like, some of the bosses towards the end were fairly challenging, and I think the game's difficulty curve overall is far more consistent as well. It starts off fairly easy, but gets quite difficult towards the end. Some of the later bosses really tested me, I gotta say. So, in that way, it's an improvement as well. So, yeah, gameplay-wise, it's all these little improvements, and it just learned all these little things doing this series that I really feel like this is the best Dark Souls game in terms of, like, gameplay and design. Really fantastic, so enjoyable, absolutely loved it. So yeah, we'll move on to the visuals now. It looks great. The art direction, as with previous games, is just stunning. Like I mentioned before, some of these environments just look absolutely incredible. I love the character models. I guess on the technical side, it's not amazing. On PC, it's actually 60 frames per second. If you have the option, you don't mind what system you play on, it's probably going to depend on which people you're playing with, though. I would go with the PC version. It's probably the superior version, pretty much, but just because of that frame rate, though. I have heard there's some crashing issues, but a patch might have fixed them. The PS4 version, which is what I played on, ran pretty good, actually. It runs at 30 frames per second, but it rarely dropped. Actually, the frame rate is pretty good. Now, the Xbox One version, from what I understand, does actually run worse, but it's probably not too bad. But yeah, the frame rate was surprisingly good. About as good as Bloodborne, I'd say, maybe even better. The loading times, on the other hand, are much better than Bloodborne. They learned from that game. No more excruciating loading times. Yeah, Firelink Shrine 2 is an awesome hub in this game. It's your hub, and the loading times it's not as annoying going back there and talking to the characters. I guess too the upgrade system, the weapon upgrade system, I really like in this game too. It's not as simplified as in Dark Souls 2, but it's not as complex or convoluted as in Dark Souls or especially Demon Souls. So yeah, I really like the upgrade system as well. Obviously, you can use your boss souls to get special weapons and special sorceries and things like that as well, and that's fantastic as well. But yeah, visually, the art direction is stunning. The graphics themselves are not amazing. I mean, this is not like From Software is not known for like being a powerhouse studio as far as like their visuals go. But again, the art direction just carries it. It carries the game so far that it really doesn't bother me that much. So yeah, yeah, loading times, like I said, are amazing. So on a technical level, it's not an amazing game for sure, by any means, but the art direction is just stunning overall. The sound design is incredible as well. Voice acting is top notch across the board. The audio is really good too. I guess I should say too. What was I gonna say? The enemy and boss design in this game takes some inspiration from Bloodborne, where there's a lot of horrific stuff in this game. Dark Souls 2 was kind of a little tame, actually, compared to the original Dark Souls, because the original Dark Souls, and especially Demon Souls, had a kind of a horror vibe, and Dark Souls 3 brings it back, which I very much appreciated. There's a location in the game that reminds me a lot of Tower of Latria, and there's some really grotesque enemy designs in this game. There's like this... actually, I don't really want to spoil it. I'm not going to spoil some of the enemy designs, but they're appropriately creepy at times. I know a lot of people complained about the amount of humanoid enemies in Dark Souls 2, and there are quite a few in this game, but I think they're more interesting in general here. So yeah, what else? I'm trying to think. I've covered about everything. This video has gone on long, I know, 27 minutes we're at right now, but I actually expected it to go on longer, but yeah, maybe not as in-depth as I thought I would go with it, but yeah, it's an amazing game. It's my favorite game this year so far, but it's, you know, as a Souls fan, it's left me completely satisfied, and I'm sure I'll be going into New Game Plus and well, not yet. I'm not going to play any new characters just yet, but later in the year I probably will be coming back to it because the Souls games are so highly replayable. But there's just so many games right now that I kind of want to move on to a different game. But if you're a Souls fan and you haven't picked it up yet, go out, get it. Yeah, you'll like it. You'll love it. If you haven't played a Souls game, I think it's a good place to start, honestly, with a lot of the improvements it's made over previous games. You know, it's just a must-play game in general. It's fantastic. But that's it, guys. If you've played it, what do you think of it? And what else have you guys been playing? I'm gonna move on to Bravely Second now, and I've actually finished Ratchet and Clank too. Actually, I'm gonna put up a review of that soon. But yeah, that's it, guys. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.